I watched strangers clamp my waterline like I didn't exist. The HOA president smiled, waving a fine until I unfolded a deed older than her entire board. One yellowed page, one seal, and suddenly their authority was mine to wield. Let me take you back. The mist on Whisper Lake clung low that morning, draped like gauze over the dark surface. I carried my mug of coffee out to the dock, the woods still damp from the night air. I expected nothing more dramatic than the lonely call of loons, and maybe the groan of my knees when I lowered myself into the old Adirondack chair. Instead, I froze halfway down the steps. At the edge of my gravel drive, two men in bright polo shirts bent over my waterline, a saw already whining. Sparks danced across the stones like fireflies gone mad. The sound jarred against the calm metal shrieking where there should have been only wind in the pines. Veronica Aldridge stood over them, clipboard propped against her hip. She spotted me and stretched a smile so wide it seemed rehearsed in front of a mirror. "Good morning, Mr. Holt," she called as if we were neighbors swapping tomatoes instead of threats. I looked at the steam curling from my coffee. "What are you doing to my pipe?" My voice rasped more than I intended. "Routine compliance," she said, gesturing toward the men. One adjusted the clamp around the valve with a grunt. The other filmed with his phone, catching every spark and every twitch of my face. Something heavy pulled in my chest. I reached for the pocket watch in my vest, my wife's silver with a hairline scratch across the lid. The tick inside was steady, defiant against the shriek of their saw. I'd wound it every night since she passed a ritual that steadied me. I didn't know it would soon echo my own fracture. I tried to keep my tone even. "I've lived here 22 years. That line's on my deed." Veronica flipped a page. Bylaws, Section 4. Unauthorized fixtures. The board voted last week. The saw cut deeper. Metal squealed. A bitter smell burned resin and hot steel pushed into the mist. One of the contractors stepped up the drive and handed me an envelope thick and official. Certified mail, the green card still stapled to the back. My name in bold block letters. I cracked it open with a thumb that trembled more than I liked. The paper rasped like dry leaves. Notice of violation, the header read. Below, a number glared at me, $5,000. The text blurred, but phrases burned clear: 30 days to comply, or face utility shutoff. I let the letter sag in my hand. Around me, the morning was wrong, the mist now more like smoke, the loons silent. My cabin, built with my wife's sketches still thumbtacked in the study, was suddenly fragile as a matchbox. Veronica tapped her pen against the clipboard. "You'll want to respond promptly. Appeals are rarely successful." Her smile thinned into something closer to a smirk. I lifted the watch again, pressed the cool silver to my palm. Still ticking, still whole. For now. The contractors finished their work with a final shriek of metal. Water stopped rushing through the pipe. The silence it left was louder than the saw. My cabin's lifeline pinched off just like that. One of them glanced at me almost apologetic, then looked quickly away when Veronica snapped her fingers. I studied the letter again, tracing the embossed HOA seal at the top. Someone had signed in blue ink, flourished loops like a proud signature on a diploma. My name appeared 3 times, each one a verdict. The mist swirled thicker, as if the lake itself didn't want to watch. I thought of the morning routine I'd lost before it even began, the faucet running while I rinsed blueberries, the kettle squealing for tea. My wife's watercolor brushes sat in a jar by the sink, brittle with dust. I'd promised myself to keep them rinsed as though she might walk in again. Without water, even that promise broke. The dock boards creaked under my boots as I stepped closer to the crew. Veronica's perfume. Something sharp synthetic cut through the smell of scorched metal. "You can't do this without due process," I said. "Due process is exactly what this is," she replied, snapping the clipboard shut. "You'll have 30 days. The clock is ticking." She looked straight at the pocket watch in my hand as if daring it to contradict her. The contractors packed up, tossing the saw into the back of a pickup, sparks still smoking on the gravel. One muttered, "Sorry, man," too low for Veronica to hear. I stood, rooted coffee gone cold, letter shaking between my fingers. I wanted to shout to chase them down the road, but the quiet side of me, trained by years of audits and city codes, held still. A quiet man can build a case. A loud one just builds an audience. The mist thinned enough to show the reflection of my cabin windows, blank and staring. For the first time, the house looked like it belonged to someone else. I traced the embossed deadline again. 30 days. The pipe, once gurgling with spring water, gave one last groan as the clamp bit tight. The sound reminded me of a door locking, the kind you know you can't open from the other side. I let the letter fall to my side. A bead of water dripped from the clamp onto the gravel, sizzling where sparks still smoldered. This place was my peace. It had been fragile for years, but now, with one motion of a saw and a flourish of a signature, it cracked. I closed the pocket watch and slid it back into my vest. The clock was indeed ticking. The community center always smelled like yesterday-old coffee, faint bleach, and tonight a thin ribbon of barbecue smoke still clinging to the HVAC like a memory no one asked for. I slid into a folding chair near the back, metal legs biting the tile. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a tired chorus that made everyone look a shade paler. Veronica stood at the front behind a plastic podium, hair sprayed into immobility clipboard, cradled like a hymn book. Her laminated stack lay beside the mic, glossy edges catching the light every time she turned a page. 12 board members flanked her in a row, hands folded, faces set to the expression bureaucrats wear when they want to look both grave and efficient. "First order of business," she said. "Mailbox height compliance." A low wave of paper shuffled. A man in a fishing shirt asked whether his mailbox, which is 2 inches above the standard, would incur a citation. Veronica tilted her head. "Uniformity protects value," she said, and the board nodded in unison. Someone on the front row scribbled uniformity on a yellow legal pad like it might save his house. We moved to bird feeders. A PowerPoint slide showed a sparrow, then a second slide with a raccoon cause and effect presented like scripture. Veronica quoted a subsection about wildlife attractants, then another about unsightly accretions. The phrase floated around the room, landing on no one and everyone. My certified letter lay folded in the pocket of my jacket, edge digging into my ribs whenever I shifted. I'd kept the green USPS return receipt stapled on proof to the inch that they'd sent what they wanted to send, and I'd received what I didn't want to receive. Every time Veronica said compliance, my thumb rubbed the paper through the fabric as if friction could erase the ink. "Next," Veronica said, and I felt the turn like a cold draft under the door water usage. A murmur rolled across the room. Chairs creaked. I could have stood, then asked to be heard, but I'd never been a man who mistook volume for strength. I watched. Veronica lifted the laminated covenant pages, flashing like fish scales. "We have observed," she said, not looking at me so much as aiming her voice, "a pattern of non-compliant withdrawal from the community aquifer by one property." She let the sentence sit plump and suggestive. "This rustic structure on the far end of Shoreline Drive has been identified as consuming beyond the good faith limits set forth in Section 4. Rustic." I tasted metal. She clicked a slide. A bar graph appeared, red bars towering over green ones. No labels, just the implied shame of tall red things. I raised my hand anyway. She held up a finger like a stop sign a teacher gives a child. "Elias," she said, choosing my first name like we were friends. "You'll have your chance." She turned to the board. "We must protect the aquifer. Drought projections. Climate concerns. You all know the story." A man in a blazer cleared his throat. "Is the cabin on well water or municipal?" he asked. Veronica didn't blink. "Both sources are impacted by overall usage patterns," she said, which wasn't an answer but sounded enough like one to pass. The board nodded again. I looked around. My neighbors, some new, some as old as the pines, stared at the screen. The fluorescent hum found a higher pitch. Somewhere an ice machine coughed. When she finally gestured toward the audience, I stood carefully, palms out. "I'd like to correct the record," I said. "Those bars, whatever they are, don't show that I'm—" She cut me with a smile. "Mr. Mercer will happily accept your written response within the appeal window." She tapped the laminated covenant. Tap, tap. "Tonight is about community education." A few heads turned toward me with the same look people reserve for a loud phone call on a quiet train. The chair under me felt smaller somehow when I sat again. Veronica produced a new sheet, the laminate stiffer edges perfectly rounded. "We have a duty," she said, and this time she looked at me the way a dentist looks before leaning in with a drill. "We will be conducting an inspection of the non-compliant property. Flow meters, monitoring, temporary access to equipment areas as allowed." She underlined aloud with her tone. One of the board members, a man with a tie patterned like tiny anchors, asked, "Do we have authority to enter?" Veronica's smile sharpened. Section 3.2. Reasonable access for inspection of utilities and easements. She turned the sheet so the board could see their own power reflected back at them in plastic sheen. "We'll of course schedule at a convenient time." convenient to whom remained unstated. The room exhaled, then inhaled gossip. I felt the temperature drop around me by a degree. A woman in a cardigan raised her hand. "Is it true he's tapping both the lake and the groundwater?" "It would be irresponsible to speculate," Veronica said while speculating. "We have indicators." Someone behind me whispered, "I heard his pump runs all night." Another voice, "My pressure's been weird." The board leaned in like parishioners at confession. I slipped the certified letter out under the lip of the chair, unfolding it so only I could see. The HOA seal glared up the blue ink signature smugly athletic. The green PS Form 3811 hung off the top like a tag saying this really happened. My hands shook the paper answering with a dry tremor of its own. I folded it back on the crease, pressing the seam with my thumb until the edge was sharp as a rule. Veronica's pen clicked a tiny gunshot. "We will proceed," she said. "Our inspectors will visit soon." The word inspectors bounced off the ceiling tiles and came back heavier. Chairs scraped. Somewhere in the hall, the vending machine thunked, dispensing something sweet to someone who hadn't lost their water yet. I raised my hand again. "What if I don't consent?" It came out steady, but my throat burned. "You'll want to consult the bylaws," she said, that same laminated page glinting. "Non-cooperation is itself a violation. We all want what's best for the community." The grin she gave me then wasn't a grin at all. It was teeth. The board voted to adjourn. No one asked for dissent. The gavel, a rubber mallet, really thumped the podium. People stood in small knots, trading opinions like recipes. A man I'd helped jump-start his truck last winter avoided my eyes with sudden interest in his shoelaces. The woman in the cardigan looked as if she had tasted something too salty, but would eat it anyway. I waited while the crowd thinned. Veronica busied herself with her stack, aligning the corners as if straight edges could make everything true. I walked to the front row and stopped a careful distance away. "You know that graph means nothing," I said. Voice low. "It means enough," she replied. "Perception is part of stewardship." "Stewardship," I repeated. "Funny word for a saw on a waterline." She glanced at my jacket pocket, the letter, the corner of the green card, peeking like a bruise. 30 days, she said softly. Tick-tock. By the time I reached the door, the fluorescent hum felt like it had installed itself directly behind my eyes. The night outside shocked me with its honesty. Air that smelled like lake and asphalt. The faint scent of last weekend's barbecue drifted from the pavilion smoke trapped under the rafters. I stood under the buzzing security light a moment and watched moths fling themselves at a bulb that would never love them back. On the drive home, my tires whispered over the tar seams, the stripes on the road strobing through the windshield. In the silence of the truck cab, I rehearsed sentences for an appeal letter that didn't exist yet. Dear Board. I thought then, deleted the politeness in my head. To whom it may concern. It all sounded like talking to a locked door. At home, I placed the letter on my kitchen table, smoothed the creases with my palm, and tucked the green return receipt beneath a paperweight, a smooth rock Martha and I had picked up on a beach in the Outer Banks, small enough to carry and heavy enough to matter. The clock over the stove ticked on honest time in an evening that had turned rubber. I lay awake for a long while, listening to the house settle. Pipes groaned, then stilled as if remembering their sudden mortality. I imagined the inspector's clipboards, company polos, the smell of new drill bits. I thought of my neighbors' faces, some closed, some curious one or two, sorry. I reminded myself how to breathe. Before dawn, I took my coffee to the doorway and watched the world blue itself into morning. The lake was a sheet of metal cold and thin. When the first sun found the tree line, I heard it, the clatter of a ladder hitting a truck bed, the slur of tires on gravel. 2 men in matching polos rolled to a stop at the top of my drive doors, opening in symmetrical unison. Each carried a clipboard. Each wore a tool belt. One hefted a case of power drills that thunked like a threat when it hit the ground. The other squinted at my porch as if measuring it for a sermon. They didn't wave. They didn't have to. The first hammer strike rattled the corrugated metal on my well house like a cheap cymbal. The inspectors had arrived with matching polos, a bucket of brass fittings, and the confidence of men who'd been told they were right. One crouched by my pressure tank, turning a wrench the wrong direction until the threads squealed. The other unspooled cable across my yard and through a patch of mint my wife once planted. The smell made a clean line in the air. Green bright, then vanished under the tang of cut rubber. "Elias," a voice called from behind the lilacs, "you need to check your deed." Hazel Murphy shuffled into view in her house shoes and a cardigan the color of pistachios, a dented steel thermos tucked under her arm. She had the steady gait of a woman who had outlived several HOA boards and a hurricane. Up close, the thermos hissed faintly. "Coffee," she said, already pouring into its cap. "It's not peace, but it'll do." On cue, the inspector by the tank dropped a washer. It pinged across the concrete pad and disappeared somewhere my fingers used to reach before 60. He glanced at me like I might help find it. I took the cup from Hazel instead. "They're putting in flow meters," I said. "They're putting on a show," Hazel answered. "The last time I saw that much laminate, it was a pancake breakfast." Across the street, Veronica stood at the cul-de-sac, phone angled just so hair, unmoving in the breeze. She wasn't filming me. She was filming herself, filming me the way some people talk to a mirror when they pray. When our eyes met, she lifted her clipboard like a communion plate. Hazel's porch was a dozen steps away, a world away. We sat on wicker chairs that creaked politely. Afternoon light slanted through lace curtains in her front window, stenciling our knees with doilies. The house smelled like warm apple pie and Murphy's oil soap, a combination that suggested comfort and the possibility of slipping on freshly polished hardwood. Hazel poured more coffee, the stream dark and sure. "You remember the Kowalskis," she said, not as a question. "I remember the for sale sign," I said. "They didn't want to go. They were made to want to go." She kept her eyes on Veronica while she spoke as if narration alone could tear a page from a story. Fake violations, emergency meetings, whisper campaigns about property values. They sold low in a seller's market because peace got too expensive to keep. The inspector tugging cable paused to read a page clipped to his board installation work order printed bold. He squinted, turned it upside down as if the instructions might make more sense inverted, then kept tugging. Hazel leaned closer. "Elias, listen to me. Your cabin is older than that association. There are deeds older than Veronica's nail polish. Find yours. Find the old filings. Take a flashlight. Those boxes eat light. I tried on the idea the way you try on a jacket in a store, hesitant, suspicious of mirrors. I thought deeds were just deeds. Deeds are stories written in ink," she said. "Sometimes they have footnotes." Another metallic clatter. The inspector at the tank had finally figured out Lefty Lucy and celebrated by launching a nut into the grass. I stood, took 2 steps toward them, then stopped. "You know what you're doing?" I asked. "Standard install," he said, not looking up. "We do these all the time. On this system," he hesitated. "Water is water," he said, which is the kind of answer that works until it doesn't. Hazel's hand, liver-spotted steady, touched my sleeve. "Don't argue with men holding tools," she said. "Go argue with paper holding ink." The mini-cliff arrived in the form of my own front door. The inspectors had snaked cable along the siding and through a gap near the wellhouse window. A piece of blue painter's tape, bright as a bruise, kept a wire in place on my clapboard. It wasn't damage, not exactly. It was suggestion. "We can go where we like." I felt my jaw set. Hazel felt it too. "Courthouse is open till 5, she said, already standing. "I'll pack you a slice for the road." The Clearbrook County Courthouse recorded everything from marriages to mistakes. The records room smelled like dust-old glue and a little like the baseball cards I used to buy at Rexall. Rows of metal shelves held boxes half crumbled from being older than most marriages. A desk fan shoved hot air from one corner to another with bureaucratic fairness. The clerk, a man my age with a tie that had seen 2 holidays too many, slid a form under the glass. "Property research," he said. "Unit number Shoreline Drive, the end lot." He exhaled as if I'd asked him to remember his first phone number. "Cabin?" he asked. There was no contempt in it, just recognition the way locals identify a lighthouse in the fog. He buzzed me in. "Deeds are in 3B, survey maps in 1C, HOA filings 2A. Sign when you take a box, sign when you put it back. If you break a clip, we don't replace clips." I signed like I was checking out a library book that might judge me. The first box came down with the weight of a bad accusation. Dust rolled off the lid and settled on my cuffs. Inside were manila folders labeled in a hand that made cursive look like a choice instead of a habit. I read. I flipped. I sneezed. My fingers blackened with the oils of men who had handled these same papers in the 1960s, men who thought a cabin and a lake were the beginning and end of a map. The fan clicked tiredly from one side to the other, unable to decide whom to help. Hour 1 turned to Hour 2. I found a chain of sales from 8 owners, a lien satisfied in 1978, and a survey that put my dock 3 feet inside the line, then another survey that swore the first survey was drunk. I found HOA and corporation documents with a date that looked younger than it should, 1987, and bylaws that smelled like laminate even as paper. I found minutes from an early meeting where someone named Lila asked if bright pink flamingos counted as wildlife attractants. Yes, in the margin with 3 exclamation points. In box 1C, toward the bottom, my fingertips slid against something smoother, a cover sheet with a county seal pressed in. The texture changed raised where the emblem bit the page, soft where time had pulled the fibers loose. I eased the folder open like it might sigh. There, in neat engineer's block letters, a survey map, a grid of lines, a sketch of shoreline, a drawn square where my cabin sits. In the corner, a note, built 1963. My pulse thudded in my ears, tidal. I checked the filing date. I checked it again. The numbers didn't move. 1963. Earlier than 1987 by 24 stubborn years. I placed the survey beside the HOA and corporation document, an old man holding twins who refused to be the same age. The contrast felt like sun on the back of my neck after a forest path. Not victory, just a path with light. I made copies. The machine wheezed like a smoker. The copies came out warm and a little crooked, official enough for a first swing. I signed them out. The clerk initialed the stamp, slammed down with a satisfying clack that traveled up my arm and changed my posture by 3 degrees. On my way out, the clerk tapped the glass. "If you're doing something with easements," he said, as if hearing my thoughts, "you'll want the 1960s development plats. The county rerouted lines back then." Where I asked. He nodded toward a steel cabinet that required the strength of a contrarian to open. Inside, bigger sheets maps with hand-drawn arrows and notes about pressure and grade. My fingertips read them like Braille. One line, thicker than the rest, cut through the properties along shoreline and crossed yes, my lot. I gathered what I dared carry and slid everything into a manila folder that felt needlessly heroic. The sun was lower when I turned onto my road. Veronica's BMW gleamed near the cul-de-sac like a well-fed cat. She stood with one foot on the curb phone to ear laughter traveling the distance like lint. When I drove past, she gave me a nod that managed to be both polite and proprietary. The inspectors were gone. The blue tape remained a flag on my siding. I left the truck running until the radio finished the weather for no reason except the company of a forecast that didn't have opinions. On my porch, something bright caught my eye, a flyer taped to the door. Crisp edges, new ink. The tape pulled a curl of paint free when I peeled it. The glue clung to my thumb like sap. At the top, in a font that wanted to look official, a headline, "Water Thief." Below it, a photograph of me lifted from some old article where I'd spoken about pipe replacement for the city cropped, so I looked like I was scowling at a faucet. Bullet points accused without naming. Endangering our community's resources, refusing reasonable conservation. The bottom line offered a number to call with concerns. The last 4 digits matched the prefix of Veronica's law firm. I held the flyer up, let the late sun backlight the cheap paper so the words thinned to shadows. The tape finally gave with a sound like a small complaint. I could feel the glue still tacky against the wood, keeping a print of its own. I slid the manila folder under my arm, the county seals pressing through to my skin like coins through cloth. The lake breathed in and out behind me, even indifferent. Across the street, Hazel's front curtains stirred. Her hand lifted in the window, one small wave, a semaphore for keep going. I opened my door and stepped inside with the papers. The house smelled like apple pie now, though none had been baked here. The hall was too small for 60 neighbors, and the heat they carried. Fluorescence buzzed, chairs scraped, and I lugged my old projector to the front table. Dust swirled in the beam as I plugged it in. For once, the outlet didn't spark. Across the room, Veronica leaned close to a man in a navy suit sliding a manila folder beneath the table. She caught my eye, smiled the way cats do when they've cornered something. "Agenda Item 5, she announced. "Water Usage Compliance." I stood before she could expand. "I'd like to present data," I said. She let me, too smoothly. The projector hummed, casting blue across the wall. "Aquifer levels, 1980 to 2019. I explained. The graph held steady flat, as the lake on a windless dawn. A murmur of surprise ran through the rows. "Slide 2, Household Usage." "I live alone," I said. "My draw's below average. It's math, not magic." Someone whispered, "Flatline," with the awe of someone who hadn't seen a straight line in a while. For a moment, heads tilted toward sense. That's when Veronica lifted the folder. She drew out a folded newspaper headline aimed like a blade, "Lake Resident Refuses Conservation Compliance." My own photo glared back cropped to make me look defiant. "It's public record," she said mildly, a profile of resistance. The lawyer beside her added, "Community officials are cited," which was true in the way fog is water. Voices in the crowd shifted. "Isn't he the widower?" "My cousin says grief makes people irrational." Another whispered, "Selfish use." I tried to press the facts. "You can request these numbers yourselves. Don't take only my word." The slide showed county contacts' neat bullet points under red light. They looked tiny beside the article's bold type. Veronica smiled heat lamp warm. "His passion is admirable, but our duty is clear inspections and monitoring." The room swayed away from me. A board member asked about low water pressure. A neighbor muttered, "Unstable." Someone else, "Problem not solution." I packed the projector cord slowly, as though neat coils might hold my pride together. Sympathetic eyes slid off me before they could land. The gavel thudded, and the crowd rose like a single body eager to leave. Outside, night air pressed cool against my sweat. I carried the projector like excess luggage. On the drive home, the radio's voices blurred into static. Each bump in the road replayed their whispers. In the cabin, heat lingered though the lake breathed cool. I set the projector down hard on the table. My vest pocket felt heavy. I took out Martha's watch, opened it for the comfort of its tick. My hand slipped. The watch fell face first, the sound thin and final. A crack spidered across the glass from 6 to 2. The tick survived faint, but altered. I sat listening to it smaller now as the silence around me grew larger. Rain stitched the dark together steady on the tin roof, 1,000 small fingers tapping a verdict I already knew. I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled low, its cone of light cutting a circle through the storm. Deeds, plats, photocopies my life flattened into paper were spread like a battlefield map. The edges had curled from damp air corners, lifting as if the pages wanted to turn themselves. I pressed a palm flat on the oldest survey and felt the raised bite of the county seal through the copy. Outside, thunder rolled across Whisper Lake and came back thinner, like a rumor. I could still see the hall from 2 nights ago. The newspaper headline in Veronica's hand, the quick way pity finds a face. Widower. Unstable. One word sticks and the rest learn to cling. I breathed through my teeth and tried to keep the room small, lamp table reign. The projector sat on the floor like a witness with nothing else to say. I pulled the 1963 file toward me again and flipped past the chain of title, past the penciled acreage and the neat block letters of the original surveyor, Bill Hicks, a hand that made even a crooked shoreline look obedient. In the margin of the deed, lower right, a faint note sloped uphill like a man writing on his knee, perpetual easement utility corridor. The words were weak in the copy, as if shy about being important. I angled the lamp and held a magnifier over the ghosted ink. Beneath it, another notation I had missed, see development plat C14 for alignment. My pulse ticked louder, syncing with the roof. The storm leaned closer. I pulled open the manila folder labeled C14 and fed out a sheet so big it eclipsed the table. Hand-drawn arrows showed a main line leaving the county part of Shoreline Road and threading along the back lots like a spine. The line thickened as it entered my parcel and then confidently kept going. Through me, I said to the empty house, not quite believing it. Through me. I wiped condensation from the lamp's shade with a dish towel and read the legend again, right-of-way for water infrastructure. Maintenance and access rights reserved to grantee and successors. The letters sat calm as stone. I touched the ridge of the seal on the corner and felt the past push up through it. Another rumble walked the roof. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and saw Veronica's smile as clearly as ink. Stewardship, she'd called it. Stewardship with a saw. My jaw locked until it hurt. I opened my eyes and let them move across the table to the folder from 1987, the HOA Incorporation. A date printed in a laser font that gave itself away. Later. A thing that came after. A thing that couldn't reach backward and claim what had existed before it thought to. My phone lit the edge of the map. Anna Mercer. Boston number. The clock on the stove read 9:41, and for once I didn't mind being called late. Dad. Her voice ran a quiet wire across the country. Someone from home shared that article. I exhaled. They make truths do tricks when they want them to. You sound tired. I am tired. The rain gave the word a second meaning. But I'm reading something that might be a ladder. A ladder, old maps. I traced the thick line with a finger smudging graphite that had survived decades. Your mother would have told me to keep reading before I got mad. She would have. Anna said, a smile audible and not quite steady, and then she would have brought you tea you didn't want. I looked at the cold coffee ring on the table. She always found the mug with the chip and used it anyway. I do that, Anna said. I use the chipped ones. The lamp hummed. So did the storm. For a minute the house felt occupied again. Are you okay, Dad? I will be. I meant it the way men mean a vow they haven't yet earned. Listen, if I'm right, the main water line to this neighborhood runs through my land. And I stopped, because, speaking, it turned it from a find into a claim. And you, she asked. I may have rights they didn't think to imagine. I let the words sit there pulsing with their own heat. Not a weapon, leverage. You don't have to fight every fight, she said gently, and I heard my own caution in her mouth. This isn't every fight, I said. It's the one in my kitchen. She laughed softly, close to tears and away from them. Promise me you'll sleep some. I'll try, I said. Promise me you won't go alone, she added, sudden and firm. Call Hazel. Call that county friend. Build your ladder with people. I will. It sounded like a plan because it was one. After we hung up, I let the quiet assemble itself again. The projector's case clicked as it cooled. A leak somewhere in the gutter found an irregular rhythm. The smell of wet pine pushed through the cracked window and laid itself across the table. I pulled the deed back, breathed on the faint handwriting, and the ghost letters darkened just enough to be sure. Perpetual easement. Not temporary, not permissive. A word that knew how to outlast. I flipped the 1987 bylaws open to the section Veronica loved to quote and read the sentence about reasonable access for inspection. It had weight inside the HOA's box, it had none outside it. The easement language stood like an older sibling behind me, taller, unimpressed. I imagined the line of pipe beneath my yard the way it would sound in my head if I lay on the grass and listened. I imagined the square metal lid near my tool shed, the one I had always stepped over as if it were scenery. On the development plat, a symbol marked that spot with a neat circle, Master Shutoff. A laugh escaped me low and disbelieving. Not delight recognition. All the years I'd walked past a door and not known it had a handle. In the middle of the table, among copies and staples, the 1963 deed waited for me to stop reacting and start acting. I pulled a pen and boxed the notation neat lines, steadying as they met their corners. Thunder stacked itself over the lake, and the roof answered. The house leaned toward the sound. You don't control this, I said to the storm and to Veronica, as if they shared an office. You never did. The mini-cliff arrived when the kitchen light flickered, the storm flexing. The bulb steadied. I took that as permission. I slid the deed, the C-14 plat, and the incorporation date into a clean manila folder, and then into my briefcase, the leather catching at the zipper where it always did. I added the county information sheet Janet had given me years back when I retired, the one with her name in the corner and a number I hoped still worked. I copied my notes onto a single page in block letters the way I used to leave instructions for night crews. Call Hazel. Call Janet. Schedule meeting. Document everything. The rain softened as if the storm had read along and found a stopping point. I wiped the ring of coffee off the table with my sleeve and turned off the lamp. The watch in my vest pocket ticked its thinner tick. I let it and didn't look. At the door, I paused, hand on the frame, eyes finding in memory the faces that had crowded the hall neighbors, some of whom I had taught to tie a fishing knot, some of whom didn't know my name beyond what they'd read. You can't make people like you. You can make them look at what's true. Veronica has no idea who really controls these pipes, I said into the dark room, testing the sentence for balance. It held. I picked up the briefcase. The leather tugged the skin of my palm in a way that felt like work. Outside, the rain thinned to a silver veil, and somewhere down the road a tree let go of what it had been holding all day. I locked the door and watched the lake breathe once, twice. Then I set the briefcase by the front steps where I couldn't miss it in the morning. The resolve arrived without heat, carved deep and quiet. By the time I pushed through the community center doors, the hum inside had turned electric. People overflowed the metal chairs' backs pressed to the cinder-block walls. The air was all fluorescent glare and warm breath. A reporter's camera clicked in bursts. A second one added a strobe of white heat. Veronica stood at the podium beneath the HOA seal and smiled as if she were about to christen a ship. Good evening, she sang, palms open to receive applause. I am pleased to report Mr. Mercer has agreed to voluntary compliance. The clapping rolled over me like warm surf. Up by the door, her handyman shifted his weight and raised a heavy wrench to his shoulder, stage prop ready. I kept my eyes on my shoes and shuffled toward the front briefcase in hand, the picture of a man who'd been taught his lesson. The act cost less than pride and bought me time. When I reached the table, I set the case down and for a heartbeat only rested my hand on the flap. The quiet in the first row had a flavor anticipation with salt. Veronica angled the mic to her mouth. Before we formalized this resolution, she said, "We want everyone to understand that our community enforces standards fairly but firmly." She turned a little, for the camera's chin lifted. Sometimes, firmness is misunderstood as hostility. A few neighbors nodded. Some didn't. I worked the zipper. It rasped open a sound too small for the size of the night. From inside, I drew a manila folder and a thick roll of maps. The handyman's wrench clicked against the wall as he adjusted his grip. Janet County Water Department Blue stood near the back with her arms folded. Hazel, 2 rows and set her thermos at her feet and gave me a single nod like a lighthouse. "I have a short addition," I said, voice dry. "Not a speech." Veronica smiled with her teeth, briefly. I rolled the first map across the table, paper unfurled with a long, breathy exhale. Lines and symbols bloomed under the lights, shoreline parcels, a bold pipe marking a path through the neighborhood's spine. The county seal in the corner caught the fluorescence and flashed back like a small sun. "This is Development Plat C-14, I said. "Filed 1963. I tapped the legend. Right-of-way for water infrastructure. Maintenance and access rights reserved to grantee and successors." The words steadied me as I said them. I slid a second document beside it, the deed copy. "This cabin predates the HOA by 24 years. Someone in the middle row whispered, 1963, like it was a password he hadn't realized he knew. Veronica laughed, a soft, incredulous sound meant for the microphones. "Historical curiosities are charming, Elias, but Hazel stood. They're not curiosities," she said, voice clearer than the PA. "They're the ground we're standing on." She looked at Janet without blinking. "Tell them." Janet stepped forward, badge catching the light. "We reviewed these filings this week," she said, words compact and practiced. "The easement and right-of-way are valid and senior to HOA authority. The main line crosses Mr. Mercer's parcel under those rights." She laid a folder with the county seal beside my map, the emblem raised under her palm like a low hill. "His documentation is correct." The first gasp wasn't loud. The second was. Row by row, heads tipped toward the paper as if gravity had relocated to the table. The handyman's wrench dipped a few inches metal, touching cinder block with a small, arrested clink. "Minnie Cliff." Frank, broad-shouldered and red at the ears, rose in the center section. "She did this to my family," he said, pointing without pride but with memory. "False violations, threats, emergency meetings. We sold at a loss to get our lives back." Another voice, Carlos from the end unit, lifted a folder thick with forms. "Service dog complaints." "Everyone thrown out. Didn't stop her knocking on my door." Murmurs turned to sentences to accounts. A woman near the aisle described fines for her husband's work van. An older couple spoke of tomatoes labeled unsightly. Words stacked like bricks building something with edges you could finally see. Veronica's smile flattened. "This is not on the agenda," she said, tapping the laminate until it clicked. The sheriff, who'd been leaning by the exit, unhooked his thumbs from his belt and stepped forward. His boots scuffed the tile with a sound that carried more than volume. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "our office has received multiple reports of false emergencies tied to HOA enforcement. We've opened an inquiry. Harassment of seniors is not a civil issue." The room fell into a clear quiet. You could hear the camera motors whir, the hum of fluorescent ballast, the breath someone held in the second row. I let the stillness widen one more second, then laid the smallest map on top of the broader sheet. A circle, neat and unassuming, sat exactly where my toolshed sits. "Master shutoff." I touched it with my finger and found my voice had lost its tremor. "All 47 homes draw through this line," I said. "The line crosses my property under the easement you've heard verified." I lifted my hand so the cameras could see the symbol. "You don't control my water," I said, looking at Veronica because there was no reason to look anywhere else. "I control yours." The sentence traveled through the room like weather. People leaned forward, then back as if balancing on a dock when a wake rolls in. A flash went off and left a ghost print in my eyes. Someone exhaled a laugh they hadn't meant to. Veronica reached for the mic. This is intimidation," she said, and her voice cracked on the last syllable. "It's infrastructure," I answered. "And responsibility. We're shutting nothing off tonight." I let that land. What we will do is schedule a safety inspection documented witnessed by the county because the system hasn't been properly reviewed since the 80s. Temporary interruption. 72 hours. Notices served to every resident with options for bottled supply and a schedule for restoration. I slid a typed protocol across the table, stamped with Janet's department crest. By the book. Janet nodded once. We'll support the inspection. Hazel's carried like a benediction. Veronica looked from paper to faces as if searching for a script. We can file an injunction, she said, but the sentence lacked a place to stand. The sheriff's voice stayed mild. File what you need to Ms. Aldridge. We'll also be requesting records of your board's complaints. He glanced at the handyman's wrench. No one is shutting off anything here for show. At the back, Dave from Morgan's Hardware lifted a hand. If we're inspecting, I'll donate gauges. I'm tired of the groaning every winter. A breeze of chuckles slipped through the rows. It felt like air returning to a room that had been holding it too long. I gathered the maps into a single visible stack and squared the edges. Neighbors, I said, this isn't punishment. It's stewardship that knows where the pipes actually run. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Frank began to clap, 1, 2, 3 measured strikes, and others joined, ragged and then not. The handyman lowered the wrench to his side as if it had become heavy. Veronica didn't clap. She stared at the circle on the map, the small word that had rearranged the furniture of the night. Her lips parted not in a smile. Cameras clicked faster now, the heat of their flashes biting at my cheeks. In the white pulse of light, her face held frozen eyes wide as if she'd just stepped into water colder than she imagined. The headline bled across half the front page, HOA, President resigns amid scandal. I read it on my porch with the sun just clearing the pines and the black ink smudged my fingertips like I'd been handling something mechanical. The paper crackled when I folded it, and the sound felt lighter than it should have. Down by the road, a pickup rattled past with a mower on a trailer. The morning smelled of fresh-cut grass and the first warm dirt of spring. Birds were going at it in the maple conversational and busy in a way that made argument seem like a winter sport. I set the paper beside my coffee and rubbed the ink off on my jeans. It left a memory anyway. A white SUV crept to a stop near the mailboxes, then idled. Veronica sat behind the wheel in oversized sunglasses, the kind people wear on planes when they'd rather sleep than be seen. A man from the management company slipped into the HOA office with a box and a few minutes later came back out carrying the wooden president nameplate. It scraped along the desk edge just loud enough to carry to the porch before it disappeared into the box's mouth. He tucked it under his arm like a small, inconvenient plank. At the sight of me, Veronica turned her face toward the passenger window. Not a full look away, just enough to make the morning choose its own subject. The SUV eased off white bright in the sun and took Shoreline Drive without the usual pop of a wave. Hazel's front door clicked, and there she was, cardigan open to the weather, carrying her thermos like a tradition. She paused at the bottom step to the porch, lifting her chin at the newspaper. Ink looks good on you, she said. Comes off, I said, showing her my fingers, with effort. She passed me a cup. The coffee was sweet today, like she'd granted me permission to have sugar. Law firm withdrew, she said as if reading a weather report. Statement said something about clarified facts and best for all parties. Lawyers write like fog. Fog is honest about being hard to see through, I said. She smiled without teeth. Frank's meeting folks by the pavilion at noon. Special election. She poured herself a half cup and held it close, warming her hands, though the air didn't require it. I told him to keep the speeches short. People want to vote, then eat. Transparency, I asked. On the menu, she said, with potato salad. We stood a minute in the ordinary quiet that comes after a thunderstorm's long night, hearing the distant thud of someone setting up folding tables. Children's voices threw themselves across the water and landed in pieces laughing. Down the hill, Frank's old Ford nosed into a space and shut off with a cough. He stepped out in a clean shirt tucked into jeans, hair combed within an inch of reasonable, holding a stack of printouts. He raised one like a waiter previewing the specials. Agenda, he called to no one in particular. Agenda with bullet points. Actual bullet points. Lord help us, Hazel said, pleased. He learned to format. Veronica reappeared once more, walking from the office to her SUV, carrying a bank box of files. Shoulders squared, chin set. She could have been a woman who'd finished her shift, a neighbor who needed to be somewhere else. Hazel followed my line of sight. Let her go, she said. We've got our own leaving to do. She cleared her throat and shifted the thermos to her left hand. With her right, she reached into her cardigan pocket and brought out a small object wrapped in a square of flannel. She held it the way you'd hold a bird you weren't sure wanted to be held. "For you," she said. "And for Martha." I cupped it. The flannel was warm from her pocket. I unwrapped slow like a child coming to the last present because the last one is the one you want to remember. The silver caught the sun and gave it back clean. The crack that had run from 6 to 2 no longer ran anywhere. The glass face was whole, the hands aligned with themselves. I pressed the crown and the lid sprang open on its hinge as if time were a practiced trick. "It's—" I started, and Hazel saved me from adjectives. "Fixed," she said. "Dave knows a jeweler who knows a glass who knows patience." I told him this one mattered. I brought the watch to my ear. The tick was steady, not louder than before, but truer because I wanted it to be. Around the edge of my hearing, the spring peepers had started up in the ditch and the mower down the road changed pitches. The watch found its place in the court of the morning. Hazel didn't move her eyes from my hands. "Thought you might want to open it where it could be seen," she said, and she tilted her head toward the road. Veronica had paused at the driver's door keys in hand, looking down at some small thing that required attention. Her phone, a clasp, the world's smallest knot. I didn't look her way so much as let her be in my periphery, a person in a painting who knows they're not the subject anymore. I clicked the lid again, just a tiny sound, and the sun threw a small coin of light across the glass. The moment didn't demand applause. It accepted daylight. If Veronica heard, she didn't show it, but the set of her shoulders seemed to register that something she'd cracked was no longer cracked. "Time to rebuild," Hazel said, and the words didn't feel like orders so much as the right sequence. At noon, the pavilion filled with the reliable forms of civic hope card tables sagging under casseroles lemonade in a cooler that complained whenever someone jammed the lid wrong, a portable speaker that wouldn't pair until Frank's nephew threatened it. Neighbors, Frank began with exactly enough volume and exactly not enough polish. He laid out the plan, emergency bylaws revisions, term limits, a public ledger for fines, monthly open forums with time limits and timers you could see. He didn't say Veronica's name. He didn't need to. Hands went up. Questions had verbs. A vote followed paper ballots tallied with the transparency of a bake sale, and Frank won in a landslide. He stood there blinking at the number like it was a sky he hadn't expected. "Thank you," he said, and the microphone fed back once in agreement. "We'll start by fixing how we fix things." Afterward, people milled in the kind of circles that include even if you only meant to pass through. Children threaded between coolers. Someone handed me a plate without asking if I wanted one. Dave came by with a coil of Pecs over his shoulder like a joke about himself. "Upgrades," he said. "My gauges are your gauges." Frank found me by the pavilion's back post where the shade held. He had a folded paper in his hand and grease on his knuckle like an honest signature. "Elias," he said, using my name like we'd both earned it. "You up for leading the infrastructure project volunteer crew? County oversight. We'll do it right." I looked past him at the lake blinking under sun and at the children chalking pirate maps on the concrete. I looked at Hazel sitting with her thermos and her plate giving people the kind of listening that turns strangers into neighbors. I looked at the watch in my palm, open ticking repaired its glass catching tiny shapes of clouds. I clicked the lid shut and felt the click in my chest. "Yes," I said. "Let's do it by the book and then make a better book." Frank grinned the grin of a man who knew the next months would include mud and arguments and satisfaction. "We start with the master shutoff," he said. "Inspect, replace what needs replacing, document twice." "Not a bad mantra," I said. He looked toward the road where the white SUV had been and wasn't. "Some things leave and some stay," he said, then shrugged like a man willing to be in charge of the part that stays. "We'll build around what matters." Hazel raised her cup at us from across the crowd. I returned it with the watch an echo of a salute. The tick kept time with footsteps and forks on paper plates and a child's shout about who got the last brownie. It felt like the sound a place makes when it remembers its own name. The ink on my fingers had faded to a gray I could mostly rub away. The balance held. The evening smelled of burgers and corn, grilling laughter carrying across Whisper Lake. Lanterns swung in the breeze, spilling warm circles on picnic tables where neighbors leaned shoulder to shoulder. Children darted between benches, their voices skipping on the water like flat stones. In my pocket, the restored watch ticked steady. I touched its glass face intact again and thought of Martha. Hazel raised her thermos in my direction as Frank tapped the mic. The squeal faded, replaced by the hush of 80 people listening. "Welcome to the first Whisper Lake Festival under our neighbor. First rules," he said. A ripple of laughter broke No Fines table this year, no violations read aloud. He held up a brass plaque, letters cut deep. The Martha Mercer Scholarship for Water Stewardship and Community Engineering. The applause started tentative, then grew. Hazel clapped above her head. A teenager wiped his eyes when she told him Martha's story. I stepped to the podium, laid the watch beside the plaque. "Martha believed in fixing things so they wouldn't break again," I said quietly. "So this fund is hers and yours, the kids who'll learn where the water truly flows." From the back, Dave pointed at the new panel board. He flipped a switch and the pump hummed alive, low and even. The digital dashboard glowed steady numbers, finally trusted. Hazel's voice carried water flows, and the crowd answered with cheers. My phone buzzed Anna calling from Boston. "I'm watching the stream," she said. "People cheered when you held up the plaque." Her voice cracked with pride. "Donations are coming in already." I smiled at the watch ticking beneath my palm. "Senior influencer at last," I teased. She laughed. I promised a longer call after the pie auction. Back on the mic, I kept it brief. Kindness is a choice. So is cruelty. Tonight, we chose wisely. Applause rose like relief. The sheriff clapped with a burger in hand. Janet pinned her number in my pocket call if a valve groans or a rumor. Neighbors mingled easily again, serving each other pie, retelling old tales. A man I hadn't spoken with in years shook my hand as if it were a tool he could trust. Later on the dock, lantern glow pooled around Hazel and me. She pressed a slice of pie into my hand. "Eat," she said. Rebuilding takes calories. We watched a boy fold a paper boat, launch it, fetch it back, adjust, then launch again. The second try held. Hazel smiled. "That's how you do it." Behind us, Frank called for one last cheer. "Thanks to Elias for guiding the upgrades. Pumps hum. Lines hold, and if they don't, we'll say so out loud." More applause, honest and even. I lifted the watch toward the lantern light. "That's our story," I said. "Or at least this chapter. But if you think that was the last HOA stunt I faced..." A ripple of laughter rolled back. "Next time, after the pie..." Lanterns swayed, smoke thinned the lake, breathed steady. The watch ticked in my palm, carrying both what we endured and what we chose to build. The old gate no longer clicks shut. Instead, laughter drifts across Whisper Lake as lanterns glow over the festival tents. I turn the pocket watch in my palm, glass flawless now, ticking steady as Hazel nods from the crowd. Justice isn't loud. It's steady, stitched back in place like the watch itself. Together, we reset the rules, opened the path and named the community fund after Martha so her kindness carries on. What healed me most wasn't winning papers or meetings, but neighbors who chose to stand close when it counted. How has your street found its way back to kindness?